And good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Coughlin with California Forward and would love to welcome you to our virtual audience to this webcast, Modernizing California's Political Reform Act for the 21st Century. Over the next hour, I'll be moderating a discussion with our panel to learn more about the work the FPPC has underway in partnership with the University of California Law Schools and California Forward to modernize California's historic ethics and campaign finance law. This work is supported by a grant from the James Irvine Foundation. In the studio with me today are the chair of the Fair Political Practices Commission, Jody Remke, David Carrillo, who is executive director of the California Constitution Center at Berkeley Law, and Jim Mayer, who is president and CEO of California Forward. Now, this webinar is intended as an introduction to the ambitious Political Reform Act revision project. Over this next hour together, we'll talk with our panelists about the Act and its origins, the purpose and objectives of this revision project, the role of the public and stakeholders, the initial work conducted by groups of UC law students, and finally, how you can continue to engage with this project and provide public comment. After covering these topics briefly with our panelists, we expect to have plenty of time to answer questions, and we expect to have plenty of questions. So let's get this started. Chair Remke, thanks for joining us this morning. And to kick it off, why don't you tell us about this project? In a nutshell, what is it all about?
Thanks, Ed. Well, as many of you know, the foundation of California's governmental ethics law is the Political Reform Act. Voters wisely approved this act over 40 years ago. And at the time, it was justly hailed as landmark political reform. But that was 40 years ago. And over 4 decades of changes to the Act, we now have a body of law that many consider cumbersome, disjointed, and at times inconsistent. So what we have set out to do is redraft the Act to streamline and simplify the law so it is intuitive and understandable, but without sacrificing accountability or weakening disclosure.
Jim Mayer, talk a little bit about who is participating and involved in this project.
So the FPPC is charged in the Political Reform Act as a steward of the law, and so they're the natural foundation for this project, and they really initiated this effort. As we started to conceptualize this project with them, it became clear that there was a need for somebody to do a lot of legwork, a lot of homework, and so we reached out to the University of California Law Schools at Davis and Berkeley, and they were eager to get involved and to get their students involved as the next generation of attorneys and people involved in the political process, and that work evolved as a partnership under the guidance and supervision of Professor Carrillo. And then California Forward assumed the role of organizing and helping to conduct the public engagement process here. The opportunities beginning with this webinar for the public, practitioners, stakeholders, candidates, incumbents, to understand what their opportunity was to contribute to this review and revision of the law.
And we'll be talking more about that engagement as the morning goes on. Professor Carrillo, that sort of leads us to an interesting question. Why law students instead of faculty or practicing attorneys in the field?
I think Jim hit it on the head when he said this is the next generation. This is going to be their Political Reform Act. It's going to be their political process. So they have an incentive. They care in general. This particular set of students is very public-minded and civically involved. So it's a group of people that honestly care about doing this kind of work and doing it well. I think it was a good idea to come to Berkeley and Davis, two of the best public law schools in the country. When we were selecting the students, Dean Johnson at Davis handpicked his half of the team. I handpicked my half of the team from the California Law Review, which is some of the best students on the Berkeley campus. As far as the students were concerned, the minor goal of this project was to provide them good work. Obviously, at a good law school, you want to do good work, and these are very talented, highly motivated, exceptional students. They do well as racehorses when they're put to the test and when you let them run hard. So this was a good project for them. It was hard work and they loved it, and it was challenging. They loved it. The major goal, obviously, was to do good work. So you go to the best law schools, you take the best students, you give them a challenging project, and you let them run with it. I'm very pleased with the result. And ultimately, the bottom line purpose, the answer to your question for why we use law students rather than faculty members is because you want fresh eyes. You want an unbiased, unjaded, non-cynical perspective on things. People who had never worked with the Political Reform Act before have no preconceptions, have no agenda, they're not partisans. They just want it to work.
Great, and a little later on we'll talk about some of the students' reaction to the work, which, as we said, was very ambitious and very constructive. So Chair Remke, let's sort of define some terms here. What is the Political Reform Act?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, the act was adopted by the voters. That was 1974 with Proposition 9. The act covers three main areas: campaign finance, lobbying, and a public official's financial conflicts of interest. The act also created the commission, the Fair Political Practices Commission, and we are, as Jim mentioned, kind of the stewards of the act and responsible for interpreting and enforcing the law. Strict enforcement of the act was and continues to be a top priority within the law.
1974, of course, was a big year when you talk about the concept of trust in government, but why don't you review for us what prompted the creation of the act and what problem was it established to solve?
Sure. As you all know, at the time, the national storyline was the Watergate scandal and a general distrust in politics and politicians. Here in California, there was increasing pressure to put some limits and rules in place at the Capitol between the lawmakers, the lobbyists, and other special interests. So also interestingly, at the time we had Secretary of State Jerry Brown. He was a big supporter of reform, and he also happened to be running for governor, so this became a really powerful political issue at the time. He won the election, Proposition 9 passed, and I guess the rest is history.
Like all of us, the act has aged since 1974. I guess all of us that were alive in 1974, the act has aged since then. When and why has it been amended over the years?
Well, it's been amended dozens of times, both through voter initiative and the legislature. In general, with the ever-changing landscape of politics and campaigns and lobbying techniques, there's always a new idea for reform. And so we will just see the reform with people pushing new ideas along the way. For example, in 2000, we had Proposition 34, which offered contribution limits as a way to control money in politics. With the passage of that proposition, we saw really just an explosion of independent expenditures in races. So in turn, we have the legislature then trying to regulate and increase disclosure on independent expenditures. So it's this constant back and forth over 4 decades that brings us to the condition we are in now.
So your idea here, and this is a very ambitious one, but what is the Political Reform Act revision project really aiming to achieve?
Well, you know, I like to use the big picture: streamline and simplify. But what we hope to achieve by doing that are really 4 key goals. Number 1, we want to encourage participation in the political process by reducing the cost and burdens of seeking office. We also would like to improve compliance and reduce technical violations by making the law easier to understand. We'd also like to increase public understanding of the law as a way to promote trust in the system. And then finally, we'd like to strengthen accountability and our enforcement efforts under the Act.
Okay, I've been sort of picking on you a little bit here,
okay,
Chair.
it's time to move on.
I'm going to ask both you and Jim Mayer to weigh in on this. First with you, Chair, is how this project came into being and who initiated it and of course, why.
So it's still back to me.
It's still
okay.
you, yeah. But there's help on the way.
So since I started this job, you know, talking with others and actually trying to understand the Act myself, it quickly became clear that, quite honestly, it's a hot mess. And I think that that is not a revolutionary idea. I think people who practice in this area have been talking about the state of the act and how cumbersome it is for quite some time. So in the office, it really became a priority to figure out how can we go about cleaning up the act. But we also realized the restrictions based on really our limited resources. So we started brainstorming and, like Jim mentioned, talking with California Forward, and the idea of working with top universities came up. So we had the law schools in place, then we had California Forward. I mean, I'm really pleased and thrilled by the way everything fell into place. The pieces are there.
And Jim, why don't you add to it in terms of not only the role that California Forward's playing, but also just sort of the how this came about?
Well, as the chairwoman mentioned, campaign finance is constantly evolving, and the tactics and the thresholds that the public is interested in terms of disclosure are constantly changing. And we actually kind of faced this crossroads when the chairwoman came to us and came to a number of the political reform organizations and said, you know, job one is really to streamline and clean up this law so we get rid of the dead passages or the conflicting passages. And then we can step back and take a look at, say, how does modern campaign finance practices, how are those reflected in the law, and where do we need to change the requirements? And so I think she was very persuasive that this was really the right first step, 41 years in, to making sure that the law was effective in the long term.
And I know we have a good response from our audience today already, Chair Remke, wondering about this project. And I'm sure one of the questions that is just hanging over this is, will it result in actual changes to what the law says and does?
Well, that's a great question. We've said from the start, and the goal here is not to make any substantive changes to the law, meaning policy changes. We won't be touching the thresholds or the contribution limits. That's not the purpose of this first step. But I also want to stress that we will be making substantial improvements to the Act. And we have really three main objectives to get to that point, and that's to reorganize, redraft, and repeal. So we're going to reorganize the Act so that, like issues and subject matters are together, and that they have clear headings. Now that sounds like a really simple task, but anyone who uses the Act knows things are scattered throughout right now. I'll just use enforcement as an example. We start with enforcement in the first chapter, and it's spread throughout to the last chapter where there's enforcement issues. Now, if I wanted to go to the Act and understand enforcement, it would really take an enormous amount of unnecessary time to get that clear understanding. So, and then second, redraft the Act in plain English. And that means using the simplest, most straightforward language to express ideas and to avoid unnecessary legalese whenever possible. It's not necessary. It's no longer considered good drafting, as I think the professor can attest to when he gets talking about it a little bit later. So that's really the second goal. And the third here is to repeal or amend sections that are no longer relevant or correct as a result of case law or other changes. So again, all of this to achieve what we hope is a law that is intuitive and understandable to the average voter. You should not have to hire a political attorney or a professional treasurer to participate in the political process.
I can hear political attorneys and treasurers just cringing all across California right now.
Well, there's always a time and a place for that.
Exactly. Jim, you mentioned that California Forward is leading the public engagement piece of this project. What's that about, and why is that important?
Well, you know, anytime a government agency would want to look at its originating statute and offer the kind of periodic cleanup that the chairwoman's been described, it would be important for that agency to embrace the public and to seek their opinion. But it seems more than a routine obligation in this case. This is a law that was established by the public in response to a public imperative that was eroding public confidence in their government. And so the chairwoman took very seriously how the public would be engaged in this process, and that's why she sought out California Forward to help them do that. And as we thought about it, we identified 4 primary objectives that we wanted to accomplish in this public engagement process. And the first, as the chairwoman suggested, was there's a real opportunity to build understanding and support for the law, for what it's accomplished, how it's evolved, and the role it plays in maintaining confidence between the public and government, as well as then how they could contribute to this process. So while there's a handful of Californians that spend a lot of time with this law, and there's hundreds or thousands that have to take actions to comply with the law, it's really something that impacts all Californians who understand and care and want to contribute to a vibrant democracy. The second one was for those Californians that feel close enough or engaged enough with this law that they want to contribute, they want to follow along or understand. We wanted to create more than one opportunity. We wanted to create easy opportunities for them to understand what was happening and to be able to contribute if they wanted to. We wanted at the end of the day for everyone to look back at not just what was done, but how it was done, and say it met the spirit and letter of good public engagement and transparency. And then we recognize that there's going to be a lot of public input. And so there's a commitment going in from the beginning to try to distill, to try to understand and distill and to reconcile the comments and feedback that come in through this process so that the commission can develop the most responsive and most responsible proposal to put before the voters, or back before the legislature.
And Jim, how will the process work? What are the mechanisms that are going to be used to engage the public and the stakeholders in this important process?
Well, so this is step one. We're doing this webinar today, and there'll be a version of this up on the website, so anybody who wants to share this information with others can do it directly. We've developed a 2-step public engagement process that provides 2 rounds of public comment. The first will begin shortly within the next couple of weeks, and it will be the work product produced by Professor Carrillo's students. And there'll be an opportunity for people to look at that, to review it, to ask questions, to submit comments. Those will be distilled down into a second iteration of the document, and that too will be put out publicly for the public to be able to understand and comment on. That will go before the commission as a final work product for their endorsement. It then gets sent to the legislature for consideration there.
And I would just add, Jim, so that's another key point here. We do have 2 lengthy public comment periods built into the timeline right now. We'll end up with a final product that we hope we have considerable buy-in from all interested parties. But then once we bring it to the legislature, that's a whole nother process for public comment and input, both obviously from the members of the legislature and again for additional groups who missed this opportunity, didn't have the opportunity right now, or just wanted to wait until that aspect of it. So again, we see this as an ongoing participation opportunity.
Professor Carrillo has been patiently sitting by and grading your performance, by the way, Chair and Jim Mayor. But Professor, tell us about the students' process and why the public should trust this process.
I took as my philosophy Ronald Reagan's famous dictum, trust but verify. So my answer is really in 3 parts. First, the students were instructed and supervised by me and my colleague Phil Ung from the FPPC that this was a style and cleanup edit only. The mantra was no substantive changes. Second thing is that part of the whole purpose of using an academic team is that they're independent. And we took some pains to make sure that the students were insulated from outside influence so that their independence wasn't impaired. You know, the whole benefit of using a student team was the fresh eyes, and we didn't want them sort of poisoned by outside influences. So we basically kept them in a bubble. And finally, the verify part is that the writing style or strategy that I use is no pride of ownership. And so no one person was in charge of any one set of changes. Everything went through multiple rounds, redundant reviews. Everything was reviewed many times by many eyes, and that's just within our team. And obviously, as the chair mentioned, there are many steps that happen after this. So it's not like the students could hide an Easter egg or a landmine somewhere in there that's not going to get caught. The FPPC staff is going to catch it. Legislative council is going to catch it. A member of the public is going to catch it. This thing, by the time it finally gets to the legislature, which I hope it does, it will have been reviewed by even more eyes. than just the student team. So really our process was a subset or a small part of the larger process, which is everyone looking at this thing and deciding how can we make it better and make it work for everyone.
Chair Remke mentioned in her comments that the current state of the law as written and amended, et cetera, is a hot mess, which is a well-known clinical term. What kind of problems do you think the students found with the law as it currently stands? And I'm guessing they wouldn't disagree with the chair.
Probably not. There were two primary categories of things that we found. The first one was when it came to us, the statutory scheme was represented to us as an onion, and we found it to be more of a casserole. So rather than layers of accretion and accumulation, everything was just sort of thrown in together. And obviously that wasn't the original intent, it just happened naturally by evolution over time. So we had an organizational issue, how to pull things apart, put them where they go, find things that are scattered that naturally belong together and bring them together. There were things that were dead letters because they'd been superseded or overturned by judicial decisions. Cross-references that were no longer valid, things that had made their way into the regulations that should have been in the statutes, and vice versa. So there was an organizational set of problems. The second set of problems that we found was the writing style. It was your typical jargon-filled, opaque statute speak that everyone hates, even lawyers, maybe especially lawyers, because we spend more time with it than anyone else does. One of the benefits of working with the student team is that they don't already know how to write like lawyers. They write like normal people. So the second set of our objectives was to transmogrify the Act into plain English. As the chair said, the law should be accessible. Anyone should be able to participate in the democratic process. And if the Act is difficult, and if there's a price barrier to participation because you have to hire experts to figure it out, that excludes people from the political process, which is the opposite of what we want. We want it to be accessible. We want it to be cheap and easy so that everyone, or at least more people, can feel free to participate. So we wanted to make it understandable.
And I just want to add one point as to the process that Jim and the professor talked about. So after the students finished their first round draft, the experts at the FPPC, the entire staff, has been reviewing that work to have a whole nother set of eyes going through it, verifying that there weren't any mistakes and changes in the law, comparing it to current law, and then again just doing another clean draft one more time through. So that's the process that is still going on right now. But I did want to just say that there's already that second set of review process going on.
And Chair, let's talk about the practical aspects of working with the law. What kind of problems has the FPPC seen over the years?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to first start with a big picture reality of what we do at the Commission. And as many of you know, we are charged with providing advice regarding the Act. And what that means currently is that we respond to between 15 and 20,000 requests for advice each year. That's through telephone, email, and letters. So you have to ask yourself, if so many people are asking for advice on this well-written, clear Act, what do we have here? And again, I think Jim mentioned the other day, and those are the people who are willing to come forward, either because they know about us, not everyone knows about us, because they know that we provide advice, and again, that they're not concerned about coming forward and asking for that advice. So there are probably a lot more out there who are struggling with the Act on their own. But that's the big picture. I think a more of an individual case-by-case situation, what we see are really two sides here. On the one side, we have the public official who, when faced with allegations of misconduct, often point to the complexity of the Act as justification. And that, for me, is personally discouraging because it really diminishes the strong rules we have in place here in California. We do have some of the best protections and restrictions in place. So that I think takes away from that. And then on the other side, you have potential candidates in some of these smaller races who look at the Act and are really pushed away from the idea of running by how complex it is and whether or not they'll be able to figure out their obligations. So I think when you look at those two, both sides of the scenario there, that's not where we want to be. So that's part of the reason behind this project.
Okay, great. I just want to remind folks, and thanks for your patience, those of you that are listening in, that we're coming up on question time very shortly, so we want to remind you that to submit questions to our panelists at any time by entering them in the question section of the GoToWebinar user interface or tweeting them through Twitter at using the hashtag PRA Talk, and we're already getting some questions in. Look forward to getting to that part of the program quickly. Jim, let's talk about the timeline for the project. What happens and when?
Well, as we've been discussing, the project's been actively underway since the first of the year when the law students began their semester. But now we're about ready to enter that public phase. And so beginning with this webinar and feedback to the process that will be solicited from this, there'll be a public review draft that will be available in the next couple of weeks. That public review time period and comment period will then close, and there'll be a second one announced, and the exact dates will be available on the website because we want to provide adequate time in between, both for the public and for the FPPC to look at those pieces. And the ultimate objective is to have a final work product before the Commission by the end of the calendar year so that the new legislature convening in January can consider this then. And
Chair, what about the public? When can they actually get involved in this?
Well, as Jim said, I think it starts today. You will receive a follow-up survey from this webinar asking you for input about the participation going forward. What level of participation would you like to have? How would you like to be notified again? We really do want to hear from as many people as possible. That will give us the best product possible. So I say it starts today, but as I mentioned earlier, right now FPP staff is finalizing the draft. I would give it a target date of posting on August 1st. So again, that will be updated on our website and California Forward, but look for that, August 1st. And then really it's the process going forward. Each public comment period, I say the first one at a minimum is going to be 6 weeks. Will kind of depend on how much feedback we get. If things start to slow down, we might just start doing the second round of redrafting. But then there'll be a second public comment period, as Jim mentioned, again, at least 4 weeks. So opportunity, please participate. That's what we're here to hear about.
So the first is we really want people to look at that work product because they may feel like they don't have an opinion or an observation about how the law can be improved, but we're confident if they look at this first draft, they will have some feedback for us. So we really encourage people to stay tuned, to get involved and to review that document and be prepared to offer some public comments. They can certainly sign up for an email update on this so that even if they're not ready to offer any comments or whether they are, they can track along with the project and they'll know where the status of it is. The Commission is offering an opportunity to meet with small groups and have discussions if people are particularly interested in parts of the law or parts of the revision and they feel like they need to know more before they can engage in an effective way. And so there's really layers of involvement here depending upon just how involved people really want to get.
Jim, let's talk a little bit about also for the people who are interested, you know, where they go to sign up and receive the ongoing information. And again, if all three of you can weigh in, I think just about the importance of participation in this.
Well, so first of all, just really pragmatically, we co-developed with California Forward, co-developed with the FPPC website, a landing page at cafwd.org/PRA. And at that place, there's more background information. An edited version of this webinar will be there, for instance, and we'll be regularly updating that information with relevant news and alerts and the status of the work. That's also a starting place for people who want to provide comments. On that page, there's a tab titled Public Input, and if you click on that button, then you will be connected to a web form where you can submit your comments to the FPPC about the proposed revisions. And as I said earlier, we'll be assisting the FPPC with this primary objective of really making sure we're listening carefully to the comments and doing everything we can to make sure we understand the suggestions that people are making and that they get incorporated into the second and then final drafts.
Great. Well, let's open it up to questions now from our virtual audience. While we've been talking this morning, staff members have been monitoring the questions that all of you have submitted via GoToWebinar or Twitter. and have summarized those questions, which I have in front of me here now. So as a reminder, if you have a question, go ahead and enter it either in the GoToWebinar or via Twitter using the hashtag PRA Talk. And I guess one thing, and Cheryl, let's start with you. And by the way, among the three of you, we encourage a conversation here. If you hear something that you want to add, please jump in. But I guess the big thing, when's this going to go to the legislature?
As been mentioned, the goal is to have the final draft by December so that we can present it to the legislature. And obviously it has to go to Leg Council, which has been mentioned will be another set of eyes over what we've done and what the finished product is. But yeah, so we wanted to hit it in January, which will be the first year of a 2-year session, which we are hoping it doesn't take 2 full years to get through, but that option is there. And so that was our goal. Again, the whole thought behind this is to make a very deliberate process. We don't want to rush anything. We want time to think about things. So yeah, that's January.
And Jim, one of the questions that just came in was, what will happen? I mean, can the legislature itself do this? Does this need to go back to the voters? I mean, what's the process exactly?
The anticipation is that all of these changes are within the purview of the legislature to make a change, but there is a 2/3 vote threshold for amending the law within the legislature. So there's provisions within the PRA for the legislature to make these changes with a supermajority vote.
Let me turn to Professor Carrillo and just sort of ask this question. I was very intrigued. I talked with him a little bit beforehand about just the students' reaction to the work, the fact how much they liked it, how much work they did, and how they hope it leads to some real change.
I think that they found it to be a very interesting and challenging project, which as a law student or as a lawyer is really all you can ask for is good, challenging, interesting work. I think that they also loved the concept that they were working on the real thing. I mean, too often as a law student, you're working on hypotheticals or moot cases. This can have a real positive impact on the political process in California. That's really exciting for students, a chance to affect actual positive change in the real world. I think that if you ask them, if I can speak for them, they would probably say the only way this project fails is if nothing happens. I think everybody who looks at the PRA can agree that some changes should be made, and while reasonable people can disagree over specifically what changes should happen, that disagreement will get worked out in the process. And so the only way that this was a waste of time is if nothing happens.
One of the questions that has popped up from people this morning is, and maybe Chair, we'll start with you, is why did we choose the process that we've described rather than speak with interest groups and other regulated entities?
Sure. I would start with a term that's been used several times, which is the fresh eyes. As top-tier law students who are trained just in the legal drafting, fresh in that process, where some of us, even lawyers, after years we forget about how concise and direct we can be in our drafting. So we thought fresh eyes, well-trained legal drafters was an excellent opportunity. But also, just based on my personal experience, I think it's an issue of efficiency. We didn't want just the drafting portion of this to take a year to 18 months as projects in the past, easily do when you come down as a group think. So the idea was that by having a finished product that we can put out to have people react to, that's easier for people to see in concrete what we're talking about, where we're going, and have them react to that, rather than first try to get that group together to bring that product out and then get the second round of reaction. So really, part of it was efficiency.
And Ed, I would add, I think that the project has been designed to explicitly solicit and engage the involvement of whether it's the practitioners, whether it's the stakeholder interest groups that use the law to pursue their mission, or whether it's the candidates and incumbents that have to deal with it in terms of compliance. As the chair is suggesting, this was about how do you efficiently engage their time, and it wasn't in doing the baseline homework. That could be done without engaging them. Where it was going to be most valuable for them was to be looking at this work product and then offering their feedback about whether it's going to resolve the issues they see, or if they have other ideas about how to resolve them. And so, as the chairwoman said, it's about efficiency, but in no way is there going to be a sacrificing of the opportunity for public to provide input. It was just respecting when and how to most efficiently ask for that.
There seems to be some questions about nomenclature, and can you describe what you believe is the difference between substantive and non-substantive change?
Is that for me?
Sure, let's start with you.
Because I'd love to answer that.
Because nobody else seems to want it, so you can grab that.
So one of the things I love about our chair is that she, like me, is a fan of Brian Garner, who is, I think, the universally acknowledged guru of good legal writing. Strike that. Not good legal writing, good writing, period.
It's like when we both said his name, it was like laser stare at each other.
Right.
Yes.
I think we're both proud owners of Brian Garner bobbleheads.
Yes.
That's how much we love this guy. Okay, and so if I can channel Brian Garner for a second, he would say that taking things out of a piece of legal writing like pursuant to and shall and behested and prior to, those things only contribute to clarity, understandability. That's the kind of thing that we focused on. So we wanted to, I talked about organizational issues, but on the plain English style conversion edit process that we did, we wanted to make it understandable. We found lots of legal speak, lots of jargon, lots of opaque language. It was bad. It's the way statutes are typically written. We wanted to make it better, and that's what we did. But what we did not do was change things like dates that things are due, amounts of money, liability provisions, enforcement provisions. We rearranged things, but we tried not to change things. We rewrote things to improve them, but we tried not to change the substance of them.
Right, and I would just stress again, because a lot of people might say then, why should we care about this project if you're not really making significant changes? But again, we're not making substantive changes, but we are making significant changes. And again, I think these will be substantial improvements to the law as a body of law.
It's about usability.
Usability.
And then, you know, there is, and there should always be a continuous debate in the public about some of those things that we would put into that substantial grip category. Should there be no gifts from certain people, and should there be more frequent reporting, or should we make that reporting track deeper into the donor base? And those are all important, significant conversations that need to happen. But that's a separate conversation from doing what the chair and the professor just described.
Right, and again, as has been mentioned, is the idea was let's get to a clean slate as how as the Act is today before we start round two of the discussions of how do we change it. But I feel like sometimes when we get into talking about substantive changes, there's not even a clear understanding of existing law and what the requirements are and where something would fit in best and how to tweak something. So again, we feel like having this very understandable, intuitive body of law, we can have those more in-depth discussions about changes.
Jim, we've got a couple of questions from folks who are sort of interested in this outside of California. Obviously, California is the reform of government in California, which California Forward has participated in actively over the last 10 years, is reaping benefits now. Folks are wondering if you think that this project, how it will be viewed outside of California, and whether people outside of California should even participate in this.
Well, I think particularly in this campaign season, in part because of the extraordinary amount of money that's going to get spent, there'll be a lot of analysis and hand-wringing about the role of money in campaigns and the role of ethic laws and disclosure requirements, and increasingly the ability of technology to change how those disclosure requirements work and whether they're effective at either influencing or changing the behavior of incumbents and candidates and donors or voters. And California has led on a lot of those issues beginning 41 years ago with the passage of Prop 9 and the PRA. And so we hope that people watch this, and we hope that people are inspired that this is a function within democracy that has to be a work in progress. And just as you want to be on the cutting edge of using technology to increase disclosure, and just as you want to make sure your requirements are as smart as possible to really provide the transparency, you also just have to have a law that people could comply with. It's not nearly as sexy, but it's just as important.
And Chair Remke, one of the, talking about inside of California, one of the questions that has come up, have you begun the outreach to the legislature to let them know this is coming?
We have definitely had some conversations, starting with key staffers who would have to review the Act and be the ones to consider what it means and the scope of it. So, but we're waiting to get to really, I think, at least phase 2. We want to see the reaction through the first public comment period to see how extensive it is, to make sure we can stay on our timeline that we have proposed. And then once we have that confidence level, we will be talking more so and reaching out more to the legislature and obviously the governor's office to see what this looks like for them.
And there's always the question of what's this costing us? What does this project cost?
Nothing. I work for free. I bought them pizza. Donuts.
That was kind of, again, like I said, it was amazing the way the pieces fell into place, being able to use the students who were, excellent, dedicated. I had an opportunity to meet with them, and a really impressive group of individuals. And then yet, it's free.
Professor, one of the things you and I talked about a little bit before, there was a quote someone used to describe this project as scraping the barnacles off of the law that have gathered over the last 40 years or so, and it just sort of seems like this is maybe an opportunity, a teaching moment for other laws and codes, et cetera, that have been on California's books for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the law evolves. It's a conversation. It's a way of organizing our society. It responds to change. We add and subtract and modify it over time. So the law is not a static thing. It's like the ocean. You can't turn your back on it because it's different every time. And I viewed our process as a smaller version, an ad hoc version of an actual official process that California has used a couple of times in the past very extensively, which is the Constitutional Revision Commission. In those instances, an actual appointed body of Californians got together and revised entire codes, the penal code, the code of civil procedure, the civil code, and presented a raft of proposed legislative amendments to the legislature, and in some instances, constitutional amendments that went to the voters. So major changes, reworkings of entire statutory schemes, codes, wholesale. We just did one small act, and I can't even imagine doing a revision commission project because this was a lot of work. So yes, the law can benefit from this. It does benefit from this kind of work. We've done this kind of work in California before on a much grander scale than this project, which is a long way of saying it's eminently worth doing. We've done this before. We need to keep doing this. You can't let the law become static. It has to grow and adapt and change, and the only way that it does is by working with it as we are.
Great. Jim and Chair, any final thoughts about the project and where we are, things you'd like to summarize before we wrap it up?
Well, I'm reflecting on that question a minute ago, Ed, when it was, what does it cost? Well, it didn't cost the taxpayers anything more. But there's obviously been an exertion from the students and some additional effort by the FPPC staff that are still doing everything they normally do in addition to the work they're doing on this. And there's the investment of the civic community, including the grant from the James Irvine Foundation to California Forward. That's an investment in the civic process. And now it's time for the public to make a contribution, and an in-kind contribution, by reading it, by giving it some thought, by reflecting on their experience, whether as an attorney or as a stakeholder and advocate, or as the chairwoman says, as one of those people that has thought about running for office but has thought maybe the chances of not complying with the law was too great to take it on. And make your own contribution to the project so that we end up with the smartest product that hopefully we won't have to do this again for another 40 years.
Okay. Chair Remke, any final thoughts?
Well, I would just like to take the moment to thank the professor and Jim, obviously, the universities and California Forward for stepping in to help us. I don't think we would be where we are today. I know we wouldn't be where we are today without their help. And then, as Jim said, now I just really encourage public participation. We want to get as much input as we can, and we're really excited about this project. We have a lot of effort behind it, and the staff at the FPPC is committed to making this work. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Professor.
Can I have one final thought?
You actually can.
I'm going to get a little scholarly for a second. There's a principle called the Condorcet jury theorem, which basically says the more people in a group deciding on something, the more likely it is that the decision that they ultimately reach is objectively correct, which I think applies here. This is a consensus project. So I don't think it's correct to look at it as this is the work product of 8 students. It's bigger than that. This is the work product of an academic team plus the FPPC, plus the public, plus the stakeholders, plus Ledge Council, plus the legislature. That's an enormous body of people. That's a huge jury. And so I'm confident that regardless of whatever disputes get worked out along the way, the ultimate decision that gets made, we can have a very high level of confidence that that's the right decision. But that only works if people participate, so get involved.
Indeed. Thank you very much. And a great session this morning. And on behalf of our project partners, we want to thank you, our virtual audience, for your active interest and participation today. We hope that many of your questions have been answered by this webcast, and please remember to visit the project website for more information and to sign up to receive email updates about the project. And we'd like to thank our panelists, FPPC Chair Jody Remke, David Carrillo of the California Constitution Center at Berkeley Law, and Jim Mayer, the CEO of California Forward. And finally, we want to thank again the James Irvine Foundation for their financial support of this project. This webcast has been recorded and will be available soon for viewing on the project website at cafwd.org/PRA. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.